A few years ago, I came across the journals of a man named Joseph. On paper, he was, well, the ultimate success story. Brilliant, disciplined, and highly educated. I mean, he held 2 separate doctorates in medicine and anthropology by his mid-20s. He wasn't some uneducated radical from the fringes of society. He was the intellectual elite. But there is a specific account of him attending a rally in the 1930s that it stays with me. When the speaker shouted that famous line, "You are nothing, your nation is everything," Joseph didn't recoil in disgust. Instead, his eyes reportedly filled with tears of pure, ecstatic relief. He spoke about following the great leader and aligning his personal goals with the national dream with the same sincerity someone might use to describe, a religious awakening. To him, the confusing complexity of the world had finally been simplified into one single glorious path. His face wasn't twisted in hate. It was glowing with what observers described as a terrifyingly peaceful sense of purpose. He felt that by surrendering his individual will, he had finally become part of something eternal. But then the scene shifts. The same man who wept with joy for the glory of the nation is seen a few years later standing on a cold railway platform in Poland. He is wearing a crisp white coat, perhaps humming a tune from a classical opera, and with a casual, almost bored flick of his thumb, he is sorting thousands of human beings, sending some to work and others directly to the gas chambers. When confronted decades later, he didn't even flinch. He simply insisted he was doing his duty and contributing to the rebirth of his people. That chilling transition from an educated, promising youth to a monster who considers mass murder a career achievement is more than just a historical footnote. It forces us to look past the symbols in the uniforms and ask, how did a civilized nation lose its mind so completely? What kind of psychological machinery can turn patriotism into a license for dehumanization? Today, we're going to peel back the layers of the most effective brainwashing system ever devised.
That is the ultimate disturbing question, isn't it? And it really challenges this fundamental assumption we have that education or, economic stability automatically inoculates a society against mass atrocity.
Exactly.
The shift you just described in Joseph, from the intellectual elite to the casual monster, that's the exact puzzle we have to solve. Our mission in this deep dive is to really dissect the sophisticated, integrated system that engineered that moral surrender.
And we aren't talking about something that happened by accident or through some sort of organic chaos. This was an intentionally constructed, interconnected system of control designed specifically to strip away independent thought.
Precisely. It was a machine. And we're going to examine 3 integrated components that worked in synergy to get that outcome.
Okay.
First, the failure and, frankly, the complicity of the highly educated professional class. This shows how moral judgment was surgically removed and replaced with just technical efficiency.
The mechanics without the morality.
Exactly. Second, the systematic erasure of individual identity, which was achieved through highly emotional, centralized mass communication. And then third, the structural enforcement mechanism, that potent combination of mass distraction and pervasive terror that guaranteed compliance, even from people who might have harbored some private doubts.
Wow.
We really need to look at this process methodically to truly understand how that moral foundation was cracked.
Let's start right there where Joseph started, with the intellectual elite. When you analyze the archives concerning, say, the medical faculty in Munich during the 1930s, you find these prototypes for figures like him. So imagine a young man, let's call him Klaus. He was brilliant, dedicated, maybe destined for academic glory. He mastered human anatomy and the cold, empirical logic of science. But his education, and this is the crucial part, was purely technical. It was a vacuum where moral philosophy, ethics, the humanities, they were all supposed to reside.
And vacuums get filled.
They get filled, in his case, with the pseudoscience of racial science.
Yeah.
There's an account of Klaus around 1937 where he was asked to sort patients in a clinic, not by whether they could be cured, but by their value to the state.
And he didn't question the premise.
Not at all. He approached it like it was a complicated algebraic problem. He didn't flinch. He had the best technical education available, yet he had zero capacity to exercise moral autonomy. For the state, his knowledge wasn't a liability, it was a huge asset. It provided the high-functioning tools to execute atrocity with this terrifying bureaucratic efficiency.
And that concept, that knowledge without an ethical compass, merely provides the means for efficient atrocity. That is absolutely central to understanding how the Nazi regime mobilized its professional class. What you're observing in this Klaus prototype, and what allowed figures like Joseph to function, is a psychological mechanism that has a name. It's known as moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement? That phrase sounds so, I don't know, so dry and clinical for such a monstrous outcome. How does a normal, a socially adjusted person flip that switch, allowing them to participate in mass murder while still viewing themselves as a good person?
It's the core insight of the celebrated psychologist Albert Bandura. He defined moral disengagement as a psychological process that allows, in his words, socially adjusted persons to disengage their internal moral standards from their destructive conduct.
So they can sort of partition their brain.
In a way. They can commit radical harms while maintaining a sense of personal virtue and self-respect. Bandura's work notes that the activation of these mechanisms in a population is an ominous barometer. It suggests a systemic moral collapse is either underway or it's imminent.
A warning sign.
A huge warning sign. And it's not about suddenly becoming a sociopath. It's about finding a sophisticated series of psychological and social steps that just redefine the boundary of what is acceptable.
And the most insidious part, like you mentioned, is how tiny that first step really was.
It was infinitesimally small, yet absolutely devastatingly effective. Leo Alexander, a psychiatrist who conducted extensive investigation into these crimes for the Nuremberg doctors' trial, he charted this exact moral trajectory. He said the path started with an infinitely small wedged-in level.
Which was?
The simple, seemingly compassionate acceptance of the attitude that there is such a thing as life not worthy to be lived.
We often think of these atrocities starting with some big top-down political decree, but Alexander suggests it started with a seemingly benign attitude toward the non-rehabilitatable sick.
Exactly. Once that one principle was intellectually accepted, that some human lives lack sufficient value to warrant preservation, the target sphere just expanded relentlessly.
It's a classic slippery slope.
The slipperiest of slopes. It began with these severely and chronically ill, those requiring the most state resources. Then it moved swiftly to include the socially unproductive, the unemployed, the perceived burdens. Then it encompassed the ideologically unwanted, the politically dangerous, and finally the racially unwanted, culminating in the targeting of all non-Germans. The tragedy is that the impetus for this entire moral earthquake began with that single, insidious acceptance toward the medically vulnerable.
And we should remember, the foundation for this kind of thinking wasn't unique to Germany at all. We had leading psychiatrists in Canada and the United States participating enthusiastically in eugenics movements, practicing forced sterilization.
That's such a vital piece of context. In the first half of the 20th century, you saw professionals in North America sterilizing over 65,000 developmentally disabled and mentally ill people, all under the banner of preventative psychiatry.
Believing they were doing good.
Believing they were purifying the gene pool, they saw themselves as rational, moral pioneers. And this established a precedent. Medical professionals abandoning healing for what they saw as a higher purpose of social engineering.
But the German doctors, they took that fatal step further. They shifted from sterilization to outright execution.
They did. Psychiatrists in Germany were absolutely crucial in crafting and deploying what was called the T4 program, which resulted in the extermination of over 400,000 psychiatric patients.
400,000.
And crucially, they didn't just participate, they innovated. The killing methods that were later scaled up for the industrial mass murder of the Holocaust, like the use of centralized gassing operations, were actually first developed and perfected by these very psychiatrists in the T4 euthanasia centers.
That is just horrifying. How did these medical experts, steeped in the Hippocratic Oath, look at themselves in the mirror while engineering mass murder? How do you reframe that act of harm as an act of good?
They managed it by completely reframing atrocity as virtue. These physicians, and we're talking about the heads of major academic departments, the respected pillars of the community, they convinced themselves they were fulfilling a beneficent Hippocratic purpose.
Beneficent.
They argued that by euthanizing those deemed incurably ill or genetically defective, they were serving the greater good of the Volk, the people. They were saving resources and ending the suffering of those whose existence was a burden.
So it was framed as an act of compassion.
They sincerely saw themselves as compassionate humanists operating at the cutting edge of a new, modern, utilitarian ethics.
So for a man like Joseph standing on that sorting platform, that wasn't an act of cruelty in his mind. It was just a necessary logistical step in a noble process.
He was fulfilling his moral duty as that had been redefined by the state. That utilitarian justification is the absolute cornerstone of moral disengagement. And to make this massive shift palatable, they employed several very specific psychological tools. Let's break down those tools that allowed them to live so comfortably with their actions.
Okay, let's unpack those. What were these critical psychological levers?
First, you have moral justification. This is the process of defining destructive conduct as serving a morally worthy cause. The actions, the systematic killing, were rhetorically reframed as virtuous, humane, progressive, and noble to achieve that wider social purpose.
So it's not murder, it's healing the nation.
Precisely. And you have to think of the intense pressure on young, aspiring doctors like our Klaus. If his respected mentor, the department head, is pioneering a humane solution that frees up hospital beds and purifies the race, well, participating isn't just career advancement, it's a sign of moral allegiance.
So they weren't bad men doing a bad thing, they were good professionals doing a difficult but necessary thing.
Exactly. The second critical tool is euphemistic language. This is the subtle softening of terminology that's used to mask the brutality of the act, distancing the perpetrator from the visceral reality of killing.
Right.
A German psychiatrist named Alfred Hosch coined that infamous phrase, life unworthy of living.
That phrase sounds so clinical, almost like a medical category rather than a death sentence.
That is exactly the function. The language has to be counterhuman to distance the professional from the moral reality of the deed. In the T4 program, they issued strict directives to replace the word killing with technical terms.
Like what?
Like terminate life, terminate the suffering, or the most famous one, special treatment. This semantic sanitization allowed the doctors to focus on the paperwork, the logistics, and the scientific theory, rather than the reality of the gas chamber. They weren't dealing with people, they were dealing with data points.
And how did the massive, overwhelming machinery of the state absorb the individual guilt? How did Joseph maintain that peaceful demeanor on the platform?
That is where diffusion of responsibility comes into play. The system has to shift accountability away from the individual practitioner. In the T4 system, for example, no single person signed the final order for execution.
It was spread out.
The decision was distributed across multiple layers. The initial diagnosis by the local doctor, then a review by a panel of experts who never even saw the patient, then the sign-off by a transport supervisor, and finally the execution by the clinic staff. Joseph on the platform was just the man coordinating logistics. He was performing a selection, not executing the entire process himself.
So he wasn't responsible for the whole machine, just his specific function within it. That's how he can stand there and claim he was just doing his duty.
Exactly. The action is seen as the product of a collective effort or a complex division of labor, which diffuses the individual's sense of moral agency. In modern contexts, we see this often in discussions of medically assisted death, where supporters emphasize the idealization of the patient's autonomy. Well, the moral focus is shifted entirely to the patient's wish. This shields the doctor from personal moral liability, even though the doctor is the absolute gatekeeper of the process. We saw this in that tragic Dutch case of Keys, where the family members diffused their own emotional and ethical burden onto the patient, framing the decision as sacred when in reality it was a systemic failure.
And when you have hundreds of highly educated people, doctors, lawyers, anthropologists like Joseph Vail, operating under this new moral framework, all using these tools of disengagement, what is the resulting structure for society?
It creates what the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton termed malignant normality.
Malignant normality.
It's the disastrous end product where moral disengagement has successfully established profoundly destructive and dangerous ideas, like the systematic extermination of specific groups, as acceptable, self-evident, and even rational. The entire professional class experiences what he called a gradual dulling of their better judgment.
So they're not operating outside the norm.
They are the norm.
Yeah.
This allows them to enthusiastically act on their primary moral imperative, their duty to the state, while inflicting massive harm, all the while preserving their self-image as virtuous, competent agents.
So the intellectual groundwork is laid. The educated elite have traded their conscience for technical efficiency and a noble-sounding mission. That provides the engine for atrocity. The foundation is set. Okay, so once the intellectual class was on board and complicit, the second massive component was the systematic erasure of individual identity for the broader population. The state needed to replace the complex, doubting private individual with a radicalized, unified collective. I was deeply struck by the letters of a young woman named Clara who lived in Berlin during the mid-1930s. Her initial diary entries were all about her personal dreams of becoming an independent painter, her unique artistic perspective. But her entries change so dramatically as she becomes immersed in what has been termed the aestheticized politics of the rallies.
Oh, yeah.
She writes so vividly of the spectacle, the geometric precision of the marching battalions, the soaring, towering pillars of light designed by Albert Speer, that famous visual effect they called the Cathedral of Light. She describes this intense hypnotic sensory experience that physically dissolved her personal sense of self. She wrote, and this is a direct quote, "When the music swells, the banners fly, and the Führer speaks, I no longer feel like Clara. I feel like Germany."
Clara's transformation is a perfect microcosm of the regime's propaganda goal. It's the substitution of a messy, questioning individual perspective with a single, clear, emotionally charged collective identity, what they call the emotional community. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, he did not trust intellectual appeals at all. He understood that, and I'm quoting him here, the masses have only a half understanding of abstract ideas, so their reactions are more expressed in the field of feelings.
So they weren't selling political policy or economic platforms. They were selling pure weaponized emotion and identity.
Precisely. Their core strategic principles were brutally simple. Avoid abstraction and relentlessly appeal to deep-seated emotions, pride, fear, and that powerful desire for belonging. The messages had to be rough, clear, and specifically aimed at the lowest common denominator, the ordinary person in the street.
And the message had to be repeated, didn't it, until it was just indistinguishable from memory.
Repetition was paramount. The strategy required constantly repeating only a handful of core ideas, utilizing stereotyped, easily digestible phrases, and critically, to manufacture that essential illusion of unanimity, they only ever gave one side of the argument.
No debate.
No debate allowed. This relentless repetition created what's called the repetition memory effect, which etches the ideology into the collective psyche until it feels like an undeniable truth.
And when the truth was too complex or contradictory to handle, they just went bigger.
That leads directly to the mechanism of the big lie. Hitler explicitly declared in Mein Kampf that to successfully confuse and manipulate the people, one must tell a big lie. He reasoned that the larger the lie, the more incredible and outrageous the claim, the more credible power it seemed to carry. The psychology behind this is chilling. The average person simply cannot fathom that an entire government could be brazen enough to invent something so immense and contradictory to reality.
So they assume there must be some truth to it.
They conclude that because the lie is so audacious and must contain a kernel of truth, no one would dare lie on that scale. This disoriented the public and made it much easier to funnel them into the emotional narrative.
That makes the sheer aggression and the simple, violent rhetoric make perfect sense. It wasn't meant to be rational. It was meant to be a psychological battering ram.
Absolutely. They employed rhetoric, utilizing simple, strong, emotionally charged words intended to incite passion and action. Words like crush, ruthless, abomination, strength, and sacrifice. This emotionally charged language was masterfully blended with the public's profound desire for national resurgence and dignity after the humiliation of World War I. This made the ideology feel less like a political program and more like an intuitive, necessary emotional response.
But to achieve that total erasure of the individual perspective, they had to ensure that alternative voices didn't even register. I mean, how do they create that singular unified soundscape for an entire nation?
Through radical media centralization. News was officially declared a weapon of war. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda was the single, all-encompassing authority that planned and executed every single shred of public communication. They oversaw every newspaper, every film, every broadcast to ensure a uniform, unwavering discourse. Newspapers were viewed as instruments of national affairs, requiring absolute, non-negotiable obedience to government commands. That completely extinguished the concept of a free press.
The genius, though, or the evil genius, was in the technology used to deliver that singular message. The radio.
The strategic deployment of the radio was brilliant and totalizing. Recognizing its immense value for transmitting political propaganda directly into the home, the regime heavily subsidized the production of the cheap people's receiver, the Volksempfänger.
Right.
They offered the original VE301 and the even cheaper DKE38, which was sometimes known darkly as the Goebbels snout.
Yeah.
It made the medium accessible even to the poorest working families through installment plans.
So it's essentially the state giving every citizen an inexpensive, captive link to the unified voice of the regime.
And this is where the control becomes technological. The cheaper receivers, like the DKE38, they suffered from a very short reception range.
And that wasn't an accident.
Well, while it kept manufacturing costs low, it is overwhelmingly speculated that this short range was a purposeful feature. It prevented citizens from tuning into non-German stations, like the BBC, which was broadcasting objective news.
And listening was a crime, right?
Listening to non-German broadcasts was elevated to a serious criminal offense. It was punishable by severe prison time, confiscation of property, placement in a concentration camp, or even capital punishment later in the war. This created a suffocating, constant, singular flow of ideology, ensuring the public gradually lost judgment under the wave of unanimous voices. For someone like Clara, this meant the individual thoughts she had, the questions she might ask, were acoustically isolated and legally perilous.
That sounds like a terrifying psychological claustrophobia, where your own private thoughts are treasonous and the airwaves provide no solace, no alternative perspective at all.
It was total acoustic and informational isolation. It forced the public into that emotional community. And once that collective energy was generated, it needed to be channeled effectively. This was done through the cult of the leader and the common enemy.
The emotional anchor, the Hitler myth.
The image of Hitler was meticulously crafted and relentlessly propagated as the selfless, heroic savior of the nation. This was crucial. He was presented as standing above politics and the bureaucracy, which made him a non-political, emotional vehicle for national cohesion. This image integrated classes. The poor worker, the wealthy industrialist, and the educated elite like Joseph could all unite their loyalty around this pure, visionary leader who represented the national dream.
So, if they disliked the corruption of their local party boss, they could still believe in the pure intentions of the Führer. It provided an emotional outlet for dissent against the bureaucracy without challenging the regime itself.
Precisely. His popularity was shielded from the day-to-day failures of governance. And this emotional connection was reinforced through aestheticized history. They commissioned these monumental, expensive historical films like Der große König, the Great King, about Frederick II, the King of Prussia.
They were using the past to validate the present.
They were mapping contemporary events and struggles, like the demands for total obedience and sacrifice, onto a glorious traditional past. These films explicitly promoted Prussian virtues: discipline, order, responsibility, and unquestioning obedience to the state. This served a critical function, establishing the moral and historical legitimacy of the dictatorship by showing that the current regime was merely the inevitable, glorious heir to an ancient, well-defined national tradition. The dictatorship wasn't a sudden political break. It was the fulfillment of historical destiny.
And finally, all that immense, centralized collective emotion, the rage, the pride, the fear, it all needed a singular, safe target to be pointed at.
That is the essential final step of scapegoating. Propaganda must facilitate the displacement of aggression by clearly specifying the targets for hatred. The regime tightly linked the public demand for national restoration and addressing complex socio-political problems with a radical anti-Semitic consciousness.
So the Jews weren't just a target. They became the ultimate explanation for everything confusing, complex, and frustrating in the world.
They became the regime's psychological defense mechanism. The leadership exploited pre-existing xenophobic and anti-Semitic sentiments to distract the public from genuine socio-political problems and economic distress. By portraying the Jews as an international conspiracy responsible for all historical and economic ills, they funneled all existing frustration into a singular external enemy.
And that made the regime stronger.
It strengthened public support for the Nazi regime immensely by cleverly blurring the lines between patriotism and radical racism, making hatred seem like an act of national duty.
So we have the intellectual elite morally disabled, and the general population unified by this intense, targeted emotional propaganda. But this high-pressure ideological system, it must be inherently brittle. What happens when the constant demands of the state, or just the sheer brutality required to maintain it, start to break that collective emotional facade? This is where the structural synergy of distraction and repression fully manifests. We have the story of Friedrich, who lived in a major city in 1938 and went to state-sponsored comedy films every Friday night. These films were part of the Strength Through Joy, or KDF, initiative, designed to keep the public smiling, compliant, and mentally numb. Friedrich would laugh at the slapstick. For 90 minutes, he could forget the rising tensions and the persistent, grim rumors of the disappeared. One evening, walking home with the theme song still running through his mind, he saw a black sedan idling in front of his neighbor's house. He saw the long leather coats of the Gestapo and heard the muffled sound of a struggle. Friedrich didn't stop. He didn't look, and he didn't question. He just turned up his collar against the cold and kept humming that movie tune.
That is the paralyzing feedback loop in pure form. The essential insight here is structural. The laughter and the subsidized pleasure were designed to overwhelm, to psychologically drown out the horrific reality occurring simultaneously. The only way for an ordinary non-committed person to survive the pervasive state terror was to fully surrender to the distraction, to choose active apathy. They were quite literally entertained into a state of total paralysis.
let's break down that distraction element. The KDF initiative, Kraft Dirk Freud, Strength Through Joy, it sounds almost utopian on the surface.
It was masterfully marketed. Established in 1933, KDF was ostensibly a populist welfare movement. It promoted the advantages of Nazism and aimed to bridge class divides by offering subsidized leisure activities and holidays previously reserved only for the wealthy. Officially, it promoted physical health, culture, and social equity.
But the true mission was far more sinister than just subsidized holidays, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Its unofficial and certainly its most critical mission was the total control of public life and the active preemption of dissent. KDF was a mass management tool dedicated to filling every single non-working moment of the German citizen's life with regime-approved pursuits.
Every moment.
This was about ensuring there was no time, no space, and no opportunity for independent organization, thought, or discussion that might lead to opposition.
The scope of this control must have been absolutely pervasive, touching every aspect of life outside the factory or the office.
It was total. KDF was divided into specialized departments, each dedicated to structuring a specific sphere of public life. You had the sports office, focused on physical education and fitness, which was explicitly geared toward creating a population physically fit for military service and industrial labor.
Okay.
You had the adult education office, ensuring that cultural and artistic topics were perfectly aligned with the regime's ideological goals. And critically, you had the leisure time office, the amped for fairer end, which was devoted to the planned and organized structuring of daily after-work activities.
So even your free time was scheduled by the state.
They organized factory performances, provided discounted tickets, and controlled every recreational aspect of spare time. The message was crystal clear. Your life, even your rest, belongs to the collective.
And the most visible, high-impact component of all of this was the massive subsidized tourism.
KDF rapidly grew into the world's largest tourism operator by 1939. This was subsidized distraction on a scale never before seen. They sold over 45 million excursions and package tours before the war began.
45 million.
And this was everything from local hikes and physical training weekends to grand extended holidays to the Alps and the Italian coast. They even built luxury cruise liners specifically for KDF use, like the famous MV Wilhelm Gustloff, offering, for example, an 18-day cruise to Madeira for the equivalent of about 4 weeks' average salary.
That's a huge material incentive for political compliance, isn't it? It's the regime saying, we can provide you with a life better than you could ever have imagined as long as you cooperate.
It's a powerful psychological contract. Conformity buys comfort. They even built these monumental tourist projects, like the uncompleted Prora Resort on the Baltic Sea, designed to house 20,000 holidaymakers at once.
Incredible.
And even the tourists themselves were subject to monitoring. Agents were planted on cruise ships to observe behavior and ensure participants represented the regime positively abroad. The organization grew to 7,000 paid employees and over 135,000 volunteers, which just shows the scale of the state's commitment to regimenting pleasure.
And the ultimate promise of this new consumer-driven life was the KDF wagon, the people's car.
The KDF wagon, which of course we now know as the Volkswagen Beetle, was KDF's most ambitious psychological and economic program. It was presented as the car every German family could afford. Buyers would save for the vehicle using an installment plan, religiously pasting state-issued stamps into a savings book. This promise was immensely powerful. I mean, the personal motor car was the ultimate symbol of individual prosperity and freedom.
But no one ever got one, did they?
Not a single private citizen. Due to the rapid shift to military production, the massive factory constructed for the KDF wagon instead began producing military vehicles like the Kubel wagon.
So the average citizen saved diligently for years, sacrificing present consumption for a future reward that never materialized. It was a consumer mirage built on a broken promise.
A mirage, yes, but an incredibly effective psychological tool. It fostered the pervasive belief that the government cared deeply for the material comfort and future of its workers. And when the war began, KDF immediately shifted from mass tourism to forming troop care units, Truppenbetreuung. This massive program staged over 300,000 performances across every theater of war, including staging entertainment for soldiers, even in concentration camps.
Why stage entertainment in a place like a concentration camp? Is that purely about morale?
It's deeper than just morale. The goal remained total control and ideological reinforcement. These units ensured the heightened physical and mental health of troops and promoted the idea that soldiers and artists, all segments of society, shared a special bond through their allegiance to the leader. It kept the ideological line uniform, demonstrating that even pleasure and art were fundamentally state tools.
But as Friedrich's story shows so clearly, distraction alone can only generate apathy. It needs that iron fist to generate paralysis.
Exactly. The distraction was only effective because of the absolute omnipresent counterforce, the enforcement of obedience through state terror. The pervasive pleasure of KDS was only possible because of the Gestapo, the state secret police.
So the few who resisted the emotional propaganda or refused the material distraction were simply crushed.
The Gestapo ensured consistent, comprehensive monitoring of the public. Dissent wasn't merely discouraged, it was obliterated. Penalties for nonconformity were severe, ranging from fines and property confiscation to being sentenced to a concentration camp or death, particularly for offenses like listening to foreign radio. This combination pervasive, subsidized pleasure filling every waking moment, coupled with the immediate knowledge that the slightest deviation meant complete and brutal obliteration, created a world where conformity and, more importantly, active apathy were the only rational choices for personal survival.
That total paralysis, where the citizen is simultaneously entertained and terrified, that is the ultimate structural manifestation of the brainwashing system.
If we synthesize these three integrated components, we see the complete blueprint for radicalizing a society and extinguishing independent thought. It began with the moral surrender of the elite, which provided the technical expertise and the pseudoscientific justification for atrocity through psychological tools like moral disengagement. That created the engine. That engine then powered the systematic erasure of individual identity, achieved by a relentless, highly emotional propaganda machine that replaced complex doubt with the simple clarity of the collective soul.
The emotional community.
And finally, the system was sustained by the structural enforcement of compliance, utilizing mass distraction and consumerist promises. The allure of the KDF wagon and the subsidized cruises, coupled with the constant paralyzing threat of absolute state terror. The genius of the system, if you can call it that, was its ability to simplify a complex, confusing world into one single glorious path of duty and collective purpose.
The chilling lesson here is that civilization, advanced education, and relative comfort are not insulating factors against these forces. The core vulnerability is the individual's willingness to accept simple, emotionally satisfying answers and to surrender critical, independent ethical judgment. That surrender is traded for the terrifyingly peaceful sense of belonging to something eternal. The transition we charted in Joseph, from the man of letters weeping with ecstatic relief to the casual monster sorting lives on a railway platform, is the ultimate terrifying demonstration that knowledge without a soul is merely a tool awaiting calibration by the hand of the state.